Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. As underemployment grows, and unemployment will grow, and many who once seemed solidly middle class are losing their economic footholds, the working class is getting larger and more frustrated. At the same time, both size and perspective make the working class more important than ever. So perhaps more than ever, Americans across the class spectrum have good reason to try and understand working class culture and experience. Millions of words have been written about the divide in America between the 1% and everyone else. But an equally powerful divide is the one between those who make policy and those who live with the consequences, even among well-meaning progressives. Sometimes the consequences of their tilting at windmills is counter to their real objectives. Part of that comes from not really understanding the lives of the working poor in America. Our perceptions of poverty and struggling all come from both our personal experience and too often from popular culture. That's why it's so singularly unique and powerful when a voice emerges that can at best connect us to make us see what that world is really like. Great voices like Eric Hoffer and Studs Terkel once made us see that world. Today, Stephanie Land adds her name to the list with her debut book, Made: Hard Work, Low Pay, and a Mother's Will to Survive. Stephanie Land, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. First of all, tell us a little bit about your early years, about where you grew up, and a little bit about your upbringing that really kind of set you on the path that you write about in Made.
Yeah, so my parents had me when they were very young. They were just turned 20, and my dad worked as an electrician, and my mom was a homemaker until she went back to school. She was the first one in our family to get a college degree, actually. And so because of that and because of their hard work, I ended up growing in the suburbs. And we didn't have a lot of money for extracurricular activities, but, I never thought that we were struggling as a kid. And so by the time I was 28 and had kind of, fumbled around in my 20s and worked at a bunch of coffee shops and figured I'd settle down and go to school at some later time because I had to pay for my own college education. I discovered I was pregnant, and so going into it, I thought my parents ended up totally fine, and the kid's dad, I figured he'd come around and be supportive, but then when my daughter was about 9 or 10 months old, we suddenly found ourselves in a homeless shelter with a couple $100 and really nothing else.
What sense did you have at that point of the world that you found yourself in? I mean, when you sat down every day to think about what's next and what you might do, what sense did you have of what options there might be of the world that you were now part of?
Well, I think first, it had never been hard for me to get a job. Mm-hmm. And I usually had 2 or 3 jobs and worked all the time, and that was just kind of my life. But suddenly I had to work not only within daycare hours, the way the child care grants are set up, because there was no way I could afford to pay for child care. So in applying for a grant, you have to have a job and a set schedule and pay stubs first before you can qualify for child care. And that's impossible because I needed someone to take care of my kid while I was working. So that part of it was so bewildering, not only to not be able to find someone who was willing to hire me, but what am I going to do with my kid while I'm working? And then there's this whole aspect of a lot of the jobs that I had done were customer service and, like doggy daycares and stuff like that. And it was the height of the recession. And so a lot of the people who had been laid off had moved into those entry-level, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday types of jobs. And I was up against 100 applicants for most positions, and I had no experience and no education.
One of the other things that you write about is that whether it was child care grants or other services that you would need along the way, how cumbersome the process was, how bureaucratic the process was. Talk a little about that.
Well, I not only felt like I had to prove that I didn't have any money, or that I wasn't secretly driving a really nice car, or I was told my complete and total assets couldn't be more than a couple $1,000s. Each state is different, but you're basically not allowed to save up money. And so there was that aspect to it. But then I also had to prove over and over and over again that I was working and that I had some type of employment and I was going there and that I was there when I said that I was going to be, because so much of government assistance is wrapped up around this work requirement, and that was bewildering to me at times, because when you're applying for food stamps, for example, you get a little bit over $1 a meal per person, and for me, that was all my food money that I had for the month, and it was a really difficult life to not only budget for that, but to be able to feed a toddler and yourself in a healthy manner.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the dreams that you had while all this was going on. Where did you have time to think about moving forward at some point?
I think it was more of just knowing that this wasn't my life, like this wasn't my real life, like this, I was eventually going to get out of it, and a lot of that was my privileged upbringing and, just the privilege of being a white person in America, I think, and so I kind of had this sense of, like, things would eventually get better, but the longer it went on, I was living under the poverty line for a good 10 years. After a while, I started to think of it as like this crushing sense of hopelessness. Like, even though I was doing everything that I possibly could and, going to college and graduated with a degree in English and, I was working as a freelance writer, there were still a couple of years after that I truly struggled, and I was really hungry, and I felt like things were not going to let up or get better.
Mm-hmm. And talk about raising your child in this context and in this environment.
I don't think she noticed much. I think, the way that her and I were together was still very much the same. I think it was, I don't know, I'm kind of nostalgic about that time in my life because there were no distractions. Like, we didn't have smartphones or TVs and so we only had each other to hang out with each other and to entertain each other. And so we ended up doing a lot of cool stuff together. But she was also like 3 or 4, so the world was new. And but she was sick a lot. She went to daycare centers that had a lot of other children who were always sick, and we lived in an apartment that was very moldy and was making us both incredibly sick. And she suffered a lot from that. And she was also shuffled around a lot. Between my work and going to school and then going to her dad's, and she became a child that needed to know what the schedule was every single day.
What about health care? You talk about being sick. What was the health care situation?
Mia was always covered, but I hardly ever was or never was. The threshold for an able-bodied adult, even with a child under 6, to qualify for Medicaid, I think you have to make like a ridiculously low amount of money, like almost no money at all. So I always made too much to qualify for Medicaid. But Mia thankfully did, and so I could take her to the doctor. She needed like ear tube. She had to get ear tubes in her ears and like her adenoids removed, and because she was just constantly coming down with sinus and ear infections and pink eye and all this stuff. So I didn't have to worry about paying for any of her prescriptions or taking her to the doctor, but I couldn't even really dream about going to the doctor.
Talk a little bit about people that you worked with and the stories that you would hear from them and the sense of other people's experience as it related to what you were going through.
I didn't have coworkers a lot of the time. Like every once in a while I would work with the owner of the company or the human resources manager or like another cleaner, but it was just for a few hours and we just kind of kept to ourselves and we didn't hang out afterwards or anything. I learned more just about the people that I was cleaning for, and they weren't always there. Like, most of the time they weren't there, but they had left behind so many clues to the type of people that they are. Like I kind of felt like I was getting to know them just from the time that I was spending in their house.
And what did you come to understand about, what we refer to today and we talk so much about today as the income divide in the country?
Well, I still saw it as a huge divide. I still saw it as an unreachable goal for me. Like I saw like not only how big these houses were, but how hard they are to keep up. But also it seemed like a lot of the people who had these huge houses, they hired me to maintain a lot of areas of them that weren't getting used at all. And that baffled me, like, because it seemed like they were never home. They were sick and, not necessarily any more happy than I was. But yet they were maintaining like this huge property and house and with their income, and then hiring me to clean it for them.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about wanting to be a writer and that being part of what kept you going at various points.
Well, I've been a daily writer since I was 10 years old, really. I had this elementary school teacher who kind of forced us to keep a journal, and for me it just stuck. And I read everything that I could get my hands on and kind of studied a lot of different writers and how they wrote. And so by the time I was in my mid-20s, I kind of knew that was who I was deep down. Like I was a writer, but I didn't know like how to go about being one, like professionally. And so I figured I'd figure all that out later in life, like when I actually had something to write about. But it became kind of like this driving force of pursuing that dream, not only for myself. Like I knew that was just what I needed to do in order to live a happy and complete life for myself, but because it was so much of my identity. But I also wanted to show Mia that no matter what the circumstance, she could pursue whatever dream that she wanted to as well.
Mm-hmm. And talk a little bit about the decision to write made and go back and relive this experience that you've went through.
Well, the book came out of an article that went viral, and that essay had started in college, and I was a very adverse student, and so I was writing about cleaning houses and being a single mom, and all of my classmates were kind of writing about their year abroad if they had one, and so I never really thought that it was anything special, or I didn't think people would find it interesting, but I pitched the essay to Vox, and it went amazingly viral, and so my agent contacted me that morning, and long story short, 11 months later, we had a book deal, but when I started writing the book, I was very much kind of on the surface, and I didn't think, even though I wanted it to be, like, I didn't think people would find my day-to-day struggle just with the bureaucracy of government assistance very interesting. But my editor was the one who brought a lot of that out, and through the editing process, I actually reread Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed,
Mm-hmm.
and was reminded, like, oh yeah, this whole entire book is about her trying to find a place to live, and it just kind of, I remembered like how not only how difficult that was, but how unique of an experience that is, and not something that people really know about, like how many hurdles poor people have to jump over in order to get the resources that they need just to meet their basic standards of living.
And why do you think that strikes a chord? Why do you think that captures people's imagination? You mentioned the article that went viral and the reaction to the book, which has been very positive and overwhelming. Talk about what you think this captures that people are so interested in.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think the country and the environment that we're living in is just getting kind of worse and worse financially, and people are really starting to struggle, and that struggle is getting closer and closer to home, especially with the government shutdown happening. Like, we saw all of these people who supposedly had really good jobs suddenly, without just 2 paychecks, could no longer afford to buy food. And our lawmakers are sitting back and saying, like, well, just take out a loan, or the president even said, like, just put it on your tab at the grocery store. And I was amazed at, like, how completely out of touch the people who are actually, like, making and creating legislation are with the lives of the people who that affects. But also, I think the story is, I think people are appreciating the story more because I am, like, a quote-unquote success story, which I hate that term, because then people say, like, oh, well, the government assistance system is successful when it's really not. But I think if I was still in the thick of it, and I was still on food stamps, and I was still struggling, and if I was, like, really angry, and, if I was a person of color even, like, I don't think people would be listening to this story as much as they are. But because I am just kind of quietly talking about this and showing them what my life was like, and I'm plain-faced and white, and I could be your sister, and, like, I have a degree, a bachelor's degree, like, people are more apt to kind of sit down and listen to that. But what I'm hoping is, like, all of this listening reaches over into empathy, and then they start listening to other people's stories that are, way worse than mine. And there's millions of stories.
Do you think, from your own experience and the overview that you have of it now, that the system is fixable, that it can work in a way that really helps people in a functional way?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if it could really happen. I mean, we're so stuck on this American myth, really, that if you work hard, then you'll make it. And so, Paul Ryan and Bill Clinton, and they created this welfare to work catchphrase, and that's implying that people on welfare don't work. When, I think it's something like 60 or 70% of people who use food banks are working and with families, and half the people on SNAP are working families. These benefits are supplementing low wages, and so we either need to come to terms with the minimum wage needing to be doubled at least, or we need to take the work requirements away and a lot of the paperwork and a lot of the bureaucracy. I don't understand why, if a parent comes to an organization and says, I can't afford to buy food for my child, why we suddenly say, okay, well, how much are you paying in rent? What's your utility bills? What kind of vehicle are you driving? Do you have a smartphone? How much is in your savings account? And then, like, how much are you working? And if you're not working enough, then you don't get the food benefit. And there's something missing there. Like, this like humanity is missing, that these are children who deserve to be fed and deserve to be cared for in places where the people taking care of them are also being taken care of. And, the health insurance is still not there for children either. And so I kind of preach that more, like, because I think that people could get behind taking care of kids, because it seems like this air of not trusting welfare recipients is just too much. Like, we've been fed this line, the welfare queen, for 30 years or something by now. And it's like ingrained in our memory, and it's what we think of whenever we think of poverty or food stamps.
Stephanie Land, her book is Made, Hard Work, Low Pay, and a Mother's Will to Survive. Stephanie, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
This
you.
was really fun.